Right guys, what's up? So here on the whiteboard behind me I've got a summary of information relating to the all-in dieter. So the typical dieter that tries to do more cardio, do more training, and consistently eat less and do all of those things together to kind of extreme degrees, we'll say. So this is kind of the typical extreme dietary approach that you'll see within the industry, and you'll see it fail quite a bit. And we see a lot of clients coming out of, like, let's say, like more extreme dietary approaches, and we get the kind of after picture. So people that may have kind of gotten results they were happy with, but that weren't sustainable, first of all, and that maybe weren't optimal. So maybe why you may have lost a lot of weight, but where did that weight come from? You know, was it your muscle tissue that you worked so hard for? Like ideally, that is the goal of dieting. We want to be able to maintain as much muscle mass as we can, because firstly, it's aesthetic. Everyone looks better if they're able to diet their fat off and keep their muscle, but also it's a pretty good like proxy for long-term maintenance of fat loss, because we know from research the people that lose more muscle mass, it's a predictor of the people that then regain their weight the fastest, because they've lost that metabolically active tissue. That is pretty beneficial for a lot of things, from the aesthetic side of things to performance to general health. Okay, so to characterize this sort of dietary approach, first we've got to kind of, you guys know what goes on. So we've got the increase in training, the decrease in nutrition, and the increase in cardiovascular exercise. And an important distinction as well is that this cardiovascular exercise typically isn't performed with the goal of performance. The goal is typically just to burn calories, and when people aren't like saying that they want to, increase their stroke volume, or they don't have specific, markers that they're measuring of their cardiovascular fitness. So rather than aiming to have a targeted increase in performance, there's actually just like the only metric people are measuring is, oh, I just want to burn calories, and that's it. And it's just a means of constantly pushing yourself further and further and further and further into that caloric deficit. And yes, we do need a caloric deficit, but it's not as simple as just looking at things in terms of that black and white energy balance equation. Okay, so you guys kind of know the approach. I'm sure a lot of you have kind of just done this in the past, where you've drastically reduced your calories, you're training 6 or 7 days a week, and then you're adding in cardiovascular exercise maybe 4 to 6 times per week on top of that as well. And you'll have noticed some of these symptoms that we're going to kind of discuss. All right. So the goals, like what are our goals when it comes to dieting? Dieting for the purpose of good body composition or good health. Our goals are obviously fat loss, but also muscle retention. So as we said, that muscle retention is pretty key if we wish to be aesthetic, or if we wish to perform well, or if we wish to optimize our health, or even just sustain our fat loss long term. So that muscle retention is key. Now, what are the components of those two things, of those two goals? Like, what do we actually need as part of a diet? What do we need to achieve? So when it comes to muscle retention, we need that muscle protein synthesis, which means the building up of muscle proteins, because our muscles are made of protein. That needs to be greater than or equal to muscle protein breakdown. So obviously, if you're synthesizing or making more muscle proteins than you're breaking down, then we're going to get this muscle protein accretion, or the building of muscle. Or if they equal out, and obviously this is over a long period of time, like day to day they both go up and down, but it's the balance we're looking for. So if they're equal on that balance, then we're going to be able to maintain our muscle mass. What we don't want is to have a higher rate of muscle protein breakdown, which then results in a net negative protein balance and the loss of muscle. Okay, so that's ideally not what we want. And a lot of the situations or the context that result from dieting and from these practices tend to favor kind of that increase in muscle protein breakdown and decrease in muscle protein synthesis. So we also want to be insulin sensitive. So like while it is a bit of an oversimplification, we essentially just want to have calorie partitioning that favors muscle over fat. I.e., when we eat our food and the food that we eat, we want to be able to use as much of that towards our muscle tissue versus our fat tissue. Because if we can end up storing more of that or using it towards the processes of muscle gain and muscle repair, etc., versus just simply pushing it into fat cells, then that is a good thing. And obviously the training stimulus and a lot of other things are a big part of that. Okay, adequate calories, and I know this is a bit of a it's obviously you can't just have a calorie surplus and expect to lose body fat. It's not that simple. But when I say adequate calories, I mean that you're not in an excessive caloric deficit, okay? So that you're just have a moderate calorie deficit and you're taking things nice and slow, and you're not surpassing that sort of 1% body weight loss per week in general for most people. That's going to be a good place to be. So if you're someone that's looking to lose like 4 kilos a week, then obviously you're going to be looking at inadequate calories and hence a lesser chance of you actually retaining your muscle mass. All right. Then we've got sleep, and like there's a lot more to this. I'm just kind of like putting in some like broad big pillars of things. So I just put in sleep because it's something I'm very keen on at the moment. It's something I'm keen to push. And yeah, sleep is absolutely huge, obviously, when it comes to potentiating the recovery process and allowing you to come in more rested and more recovered for that next training session, to allow you to elicit the training stimulus that we need in order to actually maintain that muscle mass to perform, etc., which we'll touch on further on. All right. Then fat loss. You all know, we've exhausted it time and time again, you need a calorie deficit, okay? We need that calorie deficit, but again, we want it to be moderate, and that's sort of composed of that energy expenditure, surpassing energy intake, and also adherence. So obviously we need to be adherent to any approach that we're going to put in place, or otherwise it's simply useless and there's no point even having this conversation, okay? Now, this is the main purpose of this video, is to discuss the limiting factors to you achieving your fat loss or your muscle gain or muscle retention. Like, all of this does apply to muscle gain as well, to be fair. So limiting factors, what things can hold us back or can make the whole process more difficult, or can like put a bit of a roadblock in our way, we'll say. So limiting factors, and I've just kind of put a few pillars down and then discuss some of the kind of cause and effect relating points. All right, so firstly, adherence. Obviously we want to be adherent to both our training and our nutrition. Typically people find it difficult to be adherent to their nutrition, and there are obviously some very obvious things that are in the way of that, and that is increased hunger. So if you are in a position where you are training excessively, so you're surpassing your ability to recover, you're doing so much training, you're not recovering from it, then obviously your body is going to be craving more food. If you then add excessive cardiovascular exercise, again, you're going to be craving more food. And obviously if you're eating inadequate calories in the first place, that again is going to make you hungrier and make it more difficult to adhere to your diet. So obviously we want to kind of make that adherence as easy as possible for you while still achieving results. So if you just like go straight in, do all of these things at once, i.e. excessive training, excessive cardio, and inadequate nutrition, then that hunger is going to be pretty overwhelming and difficult to overcome, especially in the presence of some of the other things. Low mood. Low mood is a huge one, especially when people do start to experience some of those symptoms of overtraining. So as you begin to train for 2, 3, 4 hours a day, which is common, without taking rest days at all, you'll start to find that your body is just in this really kind of low state, both physically and mentally, because you're not giving it adequate energy to support the reparatory processes that are necessary. Okay, so if you're constantly like damaging your body or disrupting all these physiological systems, you need to be inputting energy to then replenish and to potentiate repair. Otherwise your body is going to be crying out for help with this sort of stress response that we're going to be discussing. So if you are experiencing low mood in response to this kind of all-in dietary approach, then that should be a bit of a red flag for you, that what you're doing may be a little bit excessive, because that is your body essentially telling you that it's not able to cope. And as a result, you end up in this point where you do feel quite low, and that's going to lead to poor dietary adherence a lot of the time, except for people that are just very mentally tough. Because when we feel low, we want to pick ourselves up in some way, and like, you know, reducing training and stuff is typically not the approach that people take, although it may be a good idea. And instead people will end up doing things like binging or just simply breaking their diet in order to give themselves some pleasure through that medium that we know is so pleasurable, i.e. food. Alright? And then decrease in progress, okay? So all the other things we're going to discuss are means by which your progress could be compromised, but ultimately if you're not making progress and you're putting in all this work then that is going to likely compromise your adherence, because you're not going to trust the process, because why would you if you're putting in all this work and you're not getting anything in return? But also that lack of progress could lead you to try and do more of the things that are putting you in this bad position, and then again this is going to lead into some of the other things that are compromising adherence. So overall, not really a good place to be in terms of adherence, and a more moderate approach tends to be more conducive of good adherence to a diet or a nutrition or training plan. And then we've got stress. So stress is a big one. It's it's something that people talk about quite a bit, but tend to not really elaborate on, because it's one of those things like, oh yeah, we know stress is bad, but we don't really want to talk about why, because it's kind of complicated. But you can break it down really simply into just a couple of main pillars again, which we're going to discuss. All right. So stress, the first thing I put on the list, or the second thing, but I'm going to mention it first, is an increase in cortisol. So cortisol is this sort of stress hormone. It's a bit more complicated than that, but it's generally regarded as a stress hormone because it's one of the hormones that are released from the adrenals in response to stressful situations. But it's also released in response to caloric restriction and exercise as well. So we've got these lots of different things that are going on. So if you've got psychological stress, and then you've got lots and lots of training stress that is excessive, and then you've got inadequate calories, you've got this kind of milieu of different things that are leading to an increase in cortisol levels. So cortisol isn't necessarily bad in the short term. While it does get kind of a bit of a bad rap, it's generally kind of misunderstood. But if this cortisol is chronically elevated in response to excessive training, inadequate nutrition, and that psychological stress, then what we end up having is this chronic elevation that can lead to some unfavorable outcomes, such as muscle protein breakdown, decreased muscle recovery, increases in inflammation, decreases in insulin sensitivity. So all these things tend to be tied together, along with decreases in heart rate variability, increases in resting heart rate, and a greater sympathetic nervous system dominance. So one doesn't necessarily cause the other, they all tend to be interlinked from different areas. But ultimately we get this increase in cortisol, this increase in sympathetic nervous system activity, this increase in inflammation, decrease in insulin sensitivity, all of which come together to put you in a position where you are less primed for recovery. So you're going to have poor muscle recovery, meaning that your training frequency should technically, or training volume overall, should be reduced, but instead people tend to continue increasing it. So you're not recovering from your training, and then this feeds into you being less able to handle that stress, and that cortisol elevation becomes a little bit more chronic, favoring muscle protein breakdown, which, as we said, we don't really want, because we don't want to be losing more muscle instead of fat. So, while you may be in a calorie deficit, you may not exactly notice as much fat loss as you may think, because you could be actually losing some muscle mass in the process, which may leave you feeling sometimes even a little bit fluffier or chubbier, because you're also going to be retaining some water as a result of that increase in cortisol. So you've got an increase in water retention, and then you've got a decrease in muscle mass, and yeah, potentially you may have lost some body fat, but it may not be very noticeable if you're also retaining a lot of water and you've lost some of your muscle mass. And along with that, if you've also got depleted glycogen stores from inadequate energy and from cortisol potentiating, the breakdown of that muscle glycogen, then overall you're going to be in a less aesthetic position, which is what a lot of you care about, but also you're going to be in a pretty poor position from a health perspective as well, okay? As you increase that inflammatory environment within the body, your immune system becomes compromised, you experience more periods of illness and all that, but we don't really want to get into that for now. We want to keep this a little bit shorter without getting into the healthcare stuff. It's not really our realm. So sleep deprivation, again, it's one that's linked to stress, because as you get that increase in cortisol, we have kind of a normal cortisol rhythm throughout the day, and at the end of the day, it's normal for cortisol to drop off, and at that same point we get it like melatonin peak. So melatonin is that sleep hormone, and if cortisol isn't dropping off and it isn't having that normal rhythm where it reaches its bottom point as we go to bed, then you're not going to get that same peak in melatonin, and as a result you're potentially not going to be able to sleep as well. So if you then end up in a position where you are sleep deprived, you're then less able to tolerate stress, and your body overall is going to be in a more sympathetic dominant state, again leading to all of those things where we've got that increased sympathetic nervous system activation, we've got this increase in cortisol, we've got this increase in inflammation, and this decrease in insulin sensitivity, meaning that again we're going to be partitioning more of our calories towards body fat because we're not really able to get them into the muscles quite as well. So then in relation to cortisol and sleep deprivation as well, it's sort of a cause and effect issue, because the cortisol from stress, from the whole training stress thing that we discussed, the decrease in nutrition, that can compromise your sleep, and then that sleep deprivation can lead to further kind of perturbations to that cortisol rhythm that is supposed to be normal, so it can lead to a greater chronic elevation in cortisol and inflammation and all those things, along with that decrease in insulin sensitivity as we discussed. But sleep deprivation does also have some other effects, including increases in cravings, particularly hyperpalatable foods. So if you are sleep deprived, it is more likely you're gonna want to eat foods that are a bit more kind of junk-like, and generally you're not going to be craving salads with lean meats and feta cheese and stuff like that, alright? You're typically going to be craving your burgers, your pizzas, chocolate, etc, etc. And then if you compound that with the effect of sleep deprivation related to decision making, which when we are sleep deprived, we tend to make poor decisions, okay? We get an increase in impulsiveness, meaning that if we are faced with a situation where we have to decide between a burger or spending 20 minutes cooking a home cooked meal, we're just not going to be able to make effective decisions, and we're going to be like, yeah, I'm just going to have the burger, because you've got that increased impulsiveness, and essentially there's a lower barrier in your way to grab that food, and if you're already craving that, then with the poor decision making, it kind of makes sense that you're going to have the burger. So sleep deprivation, not really a great one, especially when tied in with stress. Then we move on to strength loss, and we've discussed a few of these things already, but obviously if you've got a decrease in recovery, if you've got muscle protein breakdown that is greater than muscle protein synthesis, and if you've got this increased calorie partitioning towards fat rather than muscle, then there's going to be a tendency for you to be a little bit poor at recovering normal muscle function, at repleting muscle glycogen. And that's really not what we want when in a calorie deficit. Ideally, when in a calorie deficit, we want to be putting all of the carbohydrates that we're eating into those muscles to potentiate the recovery process and increase muscle protein synthesis, etc. Allow us to retain muscle and allow us to retain our strength, our muscle fullness, etc. So it kind of makes sense. I don't think we have to explain too much why you would lose strength if you've got all of these different things going on. You know, there's studies showing that in high stress groups versus low stress groups, muscle recovery can be increased by as much as double. So in the low stress group, it took them 48 hours to recover their normal muscle function, meaning they could get back into the gym and perform at their best after 48 hours. But in the high stress group, it took them 96 hours. So literally double the time. So imagine that something as kind of detached as, you know, being stressed over an exam could literally leave you with half the potential to recover from your training. Like, that's not very encouraging. Then we've got NEAT, okay, so that non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which we've discussed many times. So that includes things like walking day to day. So essentially all of the activities that don't really make up a part of your formal exercise that you've planned. So even me, like moving here on the chair, making little movements, blinking, chewing, tapping my foot, etc. All of that all of those are components of NEAT. Okay, so when we're in this chronically like semi-starved state where we don't have adequate calories, we're doing excessive training, we're doing excessive cardio, then this leaves us in a position where our NEAT tends to be down-regulated, especially in the presence of things like sleep deprivation and excessive stress. Okay. So we've got that low energy, we've got fatigue or tiredness in response to the aforementioned variables, and then we've got an increase in muscle soreness as well that could potentially lead to a decrease in NEAT. So what we have to remember is that if our muscle recovery is compromised and we continue to train in a progressive manner, we're likely going to experience more muscle damage, more muscle soreness, which can then be discouraging in terms of moving day to day. You know, if you have lower body soreness, you're typically going to be less inclined to take the stairs. You're going to be less inclined to want to move around quite a bit because your body's going to be trying to kind of discourage you from irritating that painful area. Then finally we've got performance, which ties in with strength loss, but it kind of sums it up all really well. So we've got a decrease in motivation. So we're talking about the psychological component. So if you've got all of this stuff going on and you're losing strength and you don't have adequate energy, it is kind of intuitive that you would have low motivation to train in the first place. So from a mental perspective, before you even step foot in the gym, you don't have that same mental desire to perform at your best, okay? And you don't have the ability to push through reps, you don't have the ability to kind of, attempt heavy weights in the first place, because overall you're a little bit mentally suppressed, okay? So you're not quite as hyped up. And you've got low energy, so not just that mental energy, but also physical energy, okay? So if you're in that chronically semi-starved state, as I said, you're going to have lower energy in a literal sense, in terms of having less carbohydrates stored for fuel. So if you don't have that adequate fuel available, then it's sort of intuitive that you won't be able to train at your best, and it will also feed into a loss of endurance and a loss of strength, all of which tie back to reduced motivation. And then, if you've got that decrease in performance and you continue to try and do the same thing over and over again, you're just going to further make all of these issues worse, okay? So to sum it up, it all sounds a little bit catastrophic, but the reality, guys, is that people don't listen. People don't actually realize that this stuff really does matter, okay? So if you're in a position where you are training beyond your recovery capacity and you are not supporting that with adequate nutrition, you are going to have compromised ability to retain your muscle mass, to lose body fat, and also it's a health concern. And this is something we're big proponents of here at Triage, is ensuring that everything does remain health focused, okay? We do not want a chronic inflammatory environment within the body. We do not want to be sleep deprived, okay? Even things like your cognitive performance in your job and your exams or whatever are going to be compromised by being sleep deprived. And there are clinical conditions that can lead to you being sleep deprived that are very difficult to overcome. But if it's something as simple as you genuinely just training for 4 hours a day and not giving your body the food that it needs, that is causing you to be sleep deprived, then you're privileged to be able to actually fix that by addressing the causes. It may take a couple of months for you to get back into feeling your best self, but ultimately it is something that you should be doing. Because the problem is that people think that all of this stuff is helping them. And they think that we're just trying to be sort of politically correct by telling people not to do too much. And they think that there's some secret beyond what we're telling them. But, it's our job to get results with our clients. If we wanted to get the most clients, put out the most transformations, and there was a secret method, then you can sure as hell bet that we would be having them all do it. But unfortunately not. And it really is the moderate approach, the health focused approach, that is the best approach long term. So ensuring that you're only doing as much as you actually need to do to get results, while also feeding the body to an amount that is sufficient for your goal. Obviously you do need to be in a calorie deficit, but it doesn't mean you have to start eating 1200 calories right away at the start of a diet, nor does it mean that you have to do 60 minutes of cardiovascular exercise at random just for the purpose of burning calories, okay? Along with that, very few people need to be training 6 or 7 days a week. If you are someone to train 6 days per week, your sessions should be no longer than 45 to 60 minutes. And I would like to think that you're doing those 6 sessions because you don't have time to get in all of your volume, like myself. But if you're weight training 2 hours a day, 6-7 days a week, you really need to question, is that actually required? And are you just pushing yourself towards some of these negative symptoms that are going to ultimately compromise your ability to be successful with your diet and training efforts? So I hope this kind of summed up a good few things for you. Okay, so ultimately I just want to break it down into a couple of simple points to take away. Okay, if you decide that this is your approach, that you're going to train 7 days a week, do loads of cardio and not support that, recognize that you are going to experience things like elevations in resting heart rate, decreases in heart rate variability. So your cardiovascular system is affected because of this increase in sympathetic nervous system response, part of the stress response. Okay, another thing we didn't mention there is you're going to have compromised digestive health, you're going to have compromised reproductive health, and all those things tie into that overall inflammatory environment, decrease in energy availability, this constant stress response. You're going to have increases in muscle protein breakdown, so it is more likely that you're going to be losing muscle and strength, and you're in a less favorable position to lose body fat because you're going to experience more of the negative metabolic adaptations to dieting because you're not actually feeding your body or you're not recovering from the training that you're doing. So I hope that kind of clears up a couple of things. Like it was kind of hard to put this video together because it's literally addressing like 100 different factors that have all been addressed in tens of thousands of words, but hopefully you got something out of it. And thanks so much for watching, guys, and as always, any questions, drop them down below.